I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I'd always believed in our marriage. Kate and I had built a life together over 15 years, with memories from college through our late-night talks about dreams and family. We had 2 amazing kids, a beautiful home, and a life that felt stable. Solid. It was a comforting feeling, thinking we'd grown up and grown strong together, tied by trust and a history of shared dreams. I never imagined I'd question the person I'd trusted with everything. But I remember that Saturday. We were in the middle of our usual family day out, grabbing a quick bite between the kids' soccer games. I was laughing with our youngest when Kate's phone buzzed on the table. She reached over, and a name flashed on the screen, David. My smile faded. I didn't know any Davids from her work. She glanced down, gave a soft smile, one I hadn't seen in a while, a sort of warm, secret look. And then, she caught my gaze. "Who's David?" I asked, keeping my tone light, as if it didn't mean anything. But something cold was clawing its way up my spine. She shrugged, sliding her phone back into her purse. "Oh, just someone from work. You know, helping me with a new project." I felt her hand brush mine, but she quickly pulled it away. Maybe she thought she'd covered her tracks, but I'd seen something she hadn't meant to show. The rest of that day, I tried to stay focused on the kids and the familiar ease we all shared together. But that look, that smile, haunted me. Days went by, and every little thing started to seem off. Late nights became more frequent. She'd be out for work dinners, text buzzing softly in the next room. I'd glance over, hoping she'd explain, but she'd always keep things short and vague. Normally, I'd let it go, but the name, David, kept looping through my mind, picking at old wounds I hadn't realized were there. One night, I found myself wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Kate had been asleep for hours, but I hadn't slept a minute. I went over every moment, every missed dinner, every excuse, every lingering glance she'd exchanged with people at gatherings. Was I going crazy? Was I just being paranoid? I didn't want to become that guy, the one who obsessively watches his wife's every move. But my gut wouldn't let it go. It was a dull ache that wouldn't disappear. So one evening, after the kids were asleep and Kate had retreated to bed early, I found myself alone with her phone. She always kept it within reach, tucked into her purse or beside her nightstand. But tonight, she'd left it in the kitchen while charging. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, before I reached for it. I wasn't looking for specifics, just something, anything, that might quiet this feeling inside me. But all I found were carefully deleted messages, a pristine record of everyday exchanges. Nothing was out of the ordinary, no missed texts, no suspicious phone calls. I set it down, frustrated and more uncertain than before. But just as I turned to leave, her phone lit up. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "Can't wait for tomorrow night. Same time." The words sent a chill through me. I couldn't move. She had put her phone on, do not disturb, probably hoping to avoid this exact scenario. I walked back to our room, my chest tight, my heart racing as I slipped into bed next to her, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing. I couldn't believe it, but the truth was slapping me in the face. That one message was enough to confirm everything my gut had been telling me. And as I lay there, I knew I couldn't let it go. The next day, I went through the motions of a typical Sunday. I smiled, made breakfast, laughed with the kids, and kissed Kate on the cheek when she told me she'd have to work late that evening. I watched her pack up her things, slipping her phone into her bag and giving me a quick, dismissive smile. I'd never felt so alone, but I wasn't going to let it show. Instead, I made my own plan. That evening, after she left, I checked our shared phone plan online. It felt invasive, but I had no other option. I found the number, the one from her message last night. I started scrolling back through her calls, tracing her conversations with him. The late-night chats, the calls during her work meetings, the hours spent texting back and forth, it was all there. She'd been hiding it in plain sight. The next week was a blur of secrets and routines. I'd act normal, even though my heart felt like it was shattering every time I saw her smile or heard her laugh. I was planning, preparing, waiting for the right moment to act. I wasn't going to confront her without solid proof, not just for myself, but because I needed something concrete before I uprooted everything we had built together. Days later, she told me she'd be working late again. She kissed me on the cheek and told the kids goodbye. This time, I followed her. She drove to a nearby restaurant, one we'd been to on date nights. I parked across the street and watched her meet him, a tall, well-dressed man I'd never seen before. They laughed, shared inside jokes, and seemed comfortable. It was like a dagger to my chest, watching her smile at someone else with that familiar warmth. I thought about walking in, confronting them right there, but something held me back. Instead, I took pictures. I documented everything, knowing I'd need it when I finally decided to confront her. Watching her, I felt the anger and betrayal boiling up inside me, but I kept it under control. I was going to handle this my way. When she returned home that night, I pretended to be asleep, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the image of her smiling with him, laughing as if there were no care in the world. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could. Bank statements, phone records, texts, I collected it all, meticulously building my case. And then I began to write. I left her a letter, laying everything out, detailing how I'd found out, how she'd betrayed me, and what it had done to us. I wanted her to understand the pain she'd caused, the consequences she was about to face. I didn't want to leave room for excuses or apologies. The morning I left it on the table, I watched her find it, her face going pale as she read. She looked up at me, tears already in her eyes. I wanted to feel something, to forgive, to soften, but I couldn't. As she tried to apologize, I just looked at her, feeling like a stranger in my own home. "It's too late," I said, my voice steady. I hope he was worth it. After Kate read the letter, she didn't speak for a while. She sat in stunned silence, her fingers still clutching the paper. I stood across the room, hands in my pockets, waiting, hoping maybe she'd have something to say that would make all of this go away. But she just sat there, head down, looking small and guilty. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes red, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." The weight of her words fell on me, heavy and hollow. A small part of me wanted to believe her, to think that maybe this was a one-time mistake, a lapse in judgment. But the images of her laughing with that man, the late-night texts, the quiet glances at her phone, those memories were too fresh, too raw. They were a tangled mess in my mind, and no apology could untangle them. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Why him, why, any of it?" She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know. I was just lonely. You're always so busy, the kids, work, it felt like you didn't see me anymore. And David, he paid attention." She paused, and I could see the shame-etching lines across her face. "It just got out of hand." I swallowed, trying to keep my anger in check. Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd had this explanation ready for a long time, prepared for the moment she'd finally be caught. The betrayal twisted in my gut, sharp and relentless. "So, that's it? I work too much, so you just find someone else?" "No," she said quickly, looking up at me, her voice cracking. "It wasn't like that. It just happened." She reached for my hand, but I took a step back, needing the distance. I couldn't stand to let her touch me, not after everything I'd seen, everything I'd read. A silence settled between us, thick and heavy. I could see her struggling, searching for words to fix what she'd broken. "I still love you," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I want us to work through this. For the kids. For us. A bitter laugh escaped me. For the kids. You think they don't notice you're barely here? That you're constantly sneaking around? You're kidding yourself, Kate. Her face crumpled, tears spilling over as she shook her head. I was wrong, okay? I know that. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, anything. I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to find a glimpse of the woman I'd loved for all these years. But all I could see was the betrayal, like a scar that wouldn't fade. Do you even understand what you've done? I asked, my voice low. You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our family, it's all broken because of you. She flinched, and I could see the pain in her eyes. But a part of me felt detached, almost clinical, like I was watching the scene unfold from a distance. I'd expected to feel anger, maybe even fury. But all I felt was a hollow numbness, a dull ache that seemed to stretch endlessly. Please, she whispered, reaching for me again. I'll do anything. Just don't leave. For a moment, I almost softened. There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, to think that maybe, just maybe, we could fix this. But the rational side of me knew that was impossible. Too much had been broken, and I couldn't put it all back together again. I need time, I said finally, stepping back from her. Time to figure out what I want. And honestly, right now, I don't know if that includes you. Her face crumpled, and she nodded, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her mistake. I left her there, retreating to the guest room, where I could finally breathe. Alone, I let the weight of everything crash over me, each emotion hitting like a wave, the anger, the betrayal, the disbelief. I spent hours there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the whirlwind that had just torn through my life. Over the next few days, Kate tiptoed around the house, trying to stay out of my way. She'd leave small notes, asking if we could talk, if we could try to work things out. I ignored them all. I couldn't look at her without feeling that searing ache in my chest, that sense of loss for everything we'd built together. And the kids, they could sense the tension, the unspoken words that hung in the air. I hated what it was doing to them, the confusion in their eyes, the whispered questions they didn't dare ask. One night, a week after our confrontation, I finally caved. I agreed to talk, to let her explain herself fully. We sat at the kitchen table, the house silent around us. She looked tired, her face pale and drawn, as if the guilt was eating her from the inside out. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice thick with regret. I know I messed up. But I need you to understand that it was never about you. It was something broken in me. I listened, but her words felt hollow. Excuses, justifications, reasons that all boiled down to one simple truth: she'd chosen someone else over the life we'd built together. It's not enough, Kate, I said finally, shaking my head. You can say sorry all you want, but that doesn't change what you did. You made a choice that destroyed everything we had. She looked down, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. I just don't want to lose you, she whispered, her voice breaking. The pain in her eyes was real, but it wasn't enough to sway me. I'd spent years building a life with her, trusting her, loving her. And now, in the face of her betrayal, I didn't know if I could ever feel that way again. Over the next few weeks, we tried to live under the same roof, keeping up appearances for the kids. I spent more nights in the guest room, distancing myself from her. We barely spoke, only exchanging words when necessary, like strangers forced to share a space. I could see the toll it was taking on her, the way her eyes grew darker, the lines of worry etched across her face. But I couldn't bring myself to care. One night, as I was tucking the kids into bed, my oldest looked up at me, her face serious. Dad, are you and Mom okay? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We're fine, sweetheart. Just going through a tough time. She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Kids are sharper than we give them credit for, and I knew she sensed the tension. I kissed her goodnight, but the weight of her question stayed with me long after I left her room. As I lay in bed that night, the silence of the house pressing in around me, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I needed a decision, a path forward. The life we'd built was already shattered, and I wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. The following days felt like living in a ghost of a life I no longer recognized. The house, once full of laughter and warmth, now felt cold, like the air itself was waiting for something to give way. I was only going through the motions, keeping up with daily tasks to distract myself. I'd never felt so lost. One evening, as I sat alone in the guest room, I felt the weight of my isolation. It was more than just the betrayal, it was the loss of who I'd been with her, of the future I'd believed in. For 15 years, I'd poured myself into building a life with Kate. Now, everything felt like an illusion. The disbelief had started to fade, replaced by a dull, steady anger. I didn't want to live in this shadow of what we'd once had. But I also didn't know if I was ready to walk away. I avoided the conversations she kept trying to have, pretending not to notice the sadness in her eyes or the tentative way she moved around me. But eventually, I knew I'd have to face it. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I walked into the kitchen, where Kate was sitting alone, nursing a cold cup of tea. She looked up, surprised, as I took a seat across from her. "Let's talk," I said simply, my voice heavy. She looked down, bracing herself. "I didn't know if you'd ever want to," she whispered. "Well, here we are," I replied, crossing my arms, waiting. She took a shaky breath, and for the first time in weeks, she laid it all out, explaining how she'd felt neglected, how she'd convinced herself that finding someone else would fill the emptiness she couldn't explain. She spoke about feeling invisible, about losing touch with herself and with us. And then, as if she could sense my patience wearing thin, she looked directly at me. "I know nothing I say will make up for what I did," she said, her voice breaking. "But I want you to know, I never stopped loving you." I laughed bitterly. "You have a funny way of showing it." Her face fell, but she didn't argue. She sat there, looking small and worn, and a pang of something almost like sympathy stirred in me, despite everything. "What do you want, Kate?" I asked finally, my voice calmer than I felt. "I want to fix this," she said. "I want to make it right. I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to try. For the kids. For us." I sighed, leaning back in my chair, trying to clear my head. Part of me wanted to tell her it was impossible, that nothing could undo the betrayal, but the other part, the part that remembered the life we'd built, the good times, the shared dreams, wasn't quite ready to give up. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I understand. But I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes." We sat there in silence, the unspoken words between us heavy and suffocating. It was the closest we'd come to real honesty in weeks, but it only made the chasm between us feel wider. I wanted to believe her, to think that we could find our way back. But I also knew I'd never be the same. The trust was shattered, and no amount of words could put it back together. The next day, I felt the weight of our conversation in everything I did. I went to work, went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. I was distracted, my thoughts tangled in the mess of my marriage. I wanted to escape, to find a way to move past it all, but everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of her, of us. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a life I no longer wanted. When I got home that evening, Kate was waiting for me. She'd cooked dinner, a small, quiet gesture that felt almost like an apology. I sat down, and we ate in silence, the tension between us palpable. After the kids went to bed, she approached me, hesitating before speaking. "I found a therapist," she said, her voice tentative. "Someone who specializes in couples dealing with infidelity. I thought, maybe we could try. I looked at her, studying her face, searching for any sign that this was real. Do you really think a therapist is going to fix this? I asked, my voice cold. She looked down, a hint of defeat in her eyes. I don't know. But I have to try. I can't just give up on us, not like this. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe therapy could help us navigate the storm, find a way to rebuild. But I knew that it would take more than just a few sessions to heal the wounds she'd left. Fine, I said, my voice grudging. I'll go. But don't expect miracles. She nodded, relief flooding her face, and I felt a pang of something, hope, or maybe pity. I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to make any promises, not yet. The next week, we attended our first therapy session. Sitting in that room, facing a stranger who knew nothing about us, I felt exposed, vulnerable. Kate poured out her heart, explaining her reasons, her guilt, her regret. I sat in silence, listening but not really hearing. My mind was stuck on the past, on the images I couldn't shake, the hurt I couldn't forgive. The therapist asked questions, guiding us through the mess of our emotions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it mattered. How could talking about it change anything? How could it erase the pain she'd caused, the lies she'd told? Still, I kept going, partly out of curiosity, partly because I didn't know what else to do. As the weeks went by, the sessions became a ritual. Kate and I would sit in that small, dimly lit room, talking about our feelings, our fears, our broken dreams. She'd cry, and I'd sit there, numb, unable to muster the same vulnerability. I'd spent so long building walls around my heart that I wasn't sure I could ever let them down again. But slowly, something started to shift. I found myself opening up, sharing pieces of my own pain, my own doubts. I told her how betrayed I felt, how deeply her actions had cut me. And she listened, really listened, her eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. One night, after another exhausting session, we sat in the car, the silence between us heavy but not hostile. She reached over, placing her hand on mine, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't pull away. I looked at her, seeing the woman I'd once loved, the woman I'd built a life with, and I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Do you think we'll ever get past this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know. But I want to try. I want us to find a way back to each other. The vulnerability in her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, to think that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what we'd lost. But the scars of her betrayal were deep, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to look at her the same way again. Still, as we sat there in the car, holding hands for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile, like a flickering candle in a storm. But it was there, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could survive this. We drove home in silence, but this time, the silence felt different. It was filled with unspoken words, tentative hope, and a shared determination to keep trying, no matter how hard it was. As I looked over at her, I realized that the path ahead would be long and difficult, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But for the first time, I was willing to take that path, to fight for the life we'd built together. And as we pulled into the driveway, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose, a flicker of love that refused to be extinguished, even in the darkest of times. The weeks that followed felt like a strange kind of limbo. Therapy became part of our routine. I started to find some release in the sessions, and there were moments, brief as they were, where I'd look at Kate and think maybe this was worth it, that maybe, in some unexpected way, we were building something new. But every time I let my guard down, memories of her betrayal would resurface, as vivid as the day I found out. Kate threw herself into trying to rebuild my trust. She stopped working late, left her phone out in the open, and sent me messages throughout the day, just to remind me she was thinking about me. She was genuinely trying. And as much as I wanted to let my resentment go, it clung to me, quietly, like a shadow. I could tell that it was wearing on her, that she was tiring under the weight of guilt and remorse. It was an unspoken strain that grew heavier with each passing day. One rainy evening, after putting the kids to bed, I found Kate sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at her phone. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see that she'd been crying. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as if something had shattered inside her. "What's wrong?" I asked, moving closer. She wiped at her cheeks, forcing a smile. "Nothing. I was just thinking, wondering if we'll ever feel whole again." I sat down next to her, not sure what to say. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that we'd get through it. But something stopped me. I couldn't lie. "I don't know, Kate. I want to believe it, but I don't know." She nodded, looking down, her fingers twisting nervously. "I can feel it, you know. This distance. I'm trying, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think anything I do will ever be enough." The truth of her words hung in the air, cold and bitter. She was right, the distance was there, always lurking just beneath the surface, no matter how hard we tried to ignore it. "Maybe we're trying too hard to force something that's gone," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't deny the flicker of relief I felt. "Are you saying we should give up?" She shook her head, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "I don't know. I want us to work, I do. But maybe we're both hurting each other more by holding on." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I could see the weariness in her face. She was trying, but I wasn't sure if either of us could bear the weight of what had happened. We were like two broken pieces trying to fit back together, but the cracks wouldn't align, no matter how hard we tried. The next few days passed in a blur. We were still together, still trying, but there was a new sense of fragility in the air. Every word felt heavy, every touch tentative, as if we were both afraid that one wrong move would break the last of what we had left. I thought about the kids, about the life we'd built, about the memories that lingered in every corner of the house. Part of me wanted to keep trying, to hold on to the life we'd known. But another part of me, the part that had grown weary from months of mistrust and heartache, wondered if it was time to let go. One evening, I came home to find the house empty. Kate had taken the kids to her parents for the night, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. "Needed some time to think. Back in the morning. Love, Kate." I stood there, staring at the note, feeling an ache in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. I wandered from room to room, taking in the silence, the memories, the remnants of the life we'd once shared. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, memories flooding my mind. Our wedding day, the birth of our children, the quiet moments we'd shared over the years. I missed her. Despite everything, I missed her. But it was like missing someone who was already gone. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. A message from Kate, "Can we talk?" I texted back, telling her to come by whenever she was ready. An hour later, she walked through the door, her face tense, her eyes filled with a quiet resignation. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at me. I motioned for her to sit, and we sat across from each other, a chasm between us that felt insurmountable. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice steady but soft. I think we need to let go." The words hung in the air, final and irreversible. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, grief, a sense of inevitability that I couldn't deny. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of everything settle over me. "Maybe you're right." We sat in silence, neither of us daring to speak, both of us letting the reality sink in. There were no arguments, no desperate pleas. Just a quiet acceptance that what we'd shared was over. Over the next few days, we made arrangements. She'd take the kids for a while, until we figured out a way to split our time with them. We agreed to keep things civil, to prioritize the kids above all else. But there was an emptiness in the house that I couldn't shake, a hollow echo of everything we'd lost. A week later, Kate came by to pick up the last of her things. The kids were with her, laughing and playing, blissfully unaware of the new life we'd created for them. I watched as she packed up, feeling a sense of finality, a quiet sorrow that I couldn't put into words. As she was leaving, she paused at the door, looking back at me with a sad smile. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For everything." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Me too." She hesitated, as if there was something more she wanted to say, but then she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the empty house. The days that followed felt like a blur. I went through the motions, trying to adjust to the new reality, but it felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. The kids came by every other day, filling the house with laughter, but as soon as they left, the silence returned, heavy and oppressive. A month later, I got a call from Kate's mother. Her voice was trembling, filled with panic. "It's Kate," she said, barely able to get the words out. She's gone." My heart stopped, disbelief clouding my mind. "What do you mean, gone?" She couldn't take it anymore. She left a note, and, oh, God, I'm so sorry." The world spun around me as the reality of her words sank in. Kate was gone. The woman I'd loved, the mother of my children, had taken her own life, unable to bear the weight of her guilt, her regret. I sat there, stunned, unable to comprehend the finality of it. In the days that followed, I struggled to process the grief, the anger, the overwhelming sense of loss. I blamed myself, replaying every moment, every harsh word, every fight, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the life we'd destroyed together. At her funeral, I stood by the graveside, holding our children close, feeling the weight of my failure, my inability to forgive, my refusal to let go of the hurt. I watched as they lowered her into the ground, feeling a hollow ache that would never heal. And as I stood there, surrounded by friends and family, I realized that the life we'd shared, the love we'd once known, had died long before that day. In the end, we were both broken, shattered by mistakes, by betrayals, by wounds that would never mend. I walked away from her grave, carrying the weight of her memory, a haunting reminder of everything I'd lost, everything I'd failed to save. The house, once filled with love and laughter, was now just a hollow shell, echoing with the ghosts of a life that could never be rebuilt. And as the years passed, I carried that burden with me, a scar that would never fade, a silent testament to the love that had destroyed us both.